to bring this to a close, we are going to, I started the show by giving gifts. We're going to give the gift of optimism to all the 5 worst NBA teams. So, Dan, to start with the Charlotte Hornets, they are first here on the rundown. What is something that you are most interested about for the Charlotte Hornets moving forward?
Yeah, it's just that like Brandon Miller was worth it, right? And looks like they nailed that. And whatever the next version of the Hornets is going to be, he will fit it and he will help make it work. There was all the jokes sort of before in the pre-draft process with Brandon Miller about like him saying that Paul George was his GOAT, right? And your mileage may vary on that, that evaluation, but what makes Paul George and what has made him such a great player and what continues to make him a great player, and if he gets to free agency, will make him the most valued free agent on the board and whatever, is that kind of like he will take the shape of whatever container you put him in, and wherever you need him to fit, he can fit. And I think that's the outline of Brandon Miller, right? Like when they had him playing with LaMelo Ball, he was off the ball more. He was, being able to play off of a primary playmaker. The Hornets, when they had both those guys on the floor, the Hornets are terrible. Let's start there. Everyone knows this. They are one of, I think, 29th in offensive efficiency this season. They were like a league average offense with LaMelo and Brandon Miller on the floor. And that's not, anything to do cartwheels about, but you have a primary playmaker who's going to dominate the ball, and you can have a guy who can run off pin downs off the ball, who can create as a second side action guy, who can be a lane filler in transition, a spot up threat away from it. Like Brandon Miller can work off of all of that. LaMelo Ball goes down. They trade Terry Rozier end of January. And now his usage rate goes up and he's using more than a quarter of Charlotte's possessions. His time of possession goes up. His touches go up. I think only Miles Bridges is getting more touches per game than him. And his efficiency stays pretty solid and the numbers all go up. And it's something like 19 points, 6.5 rebounds, 3.5 assists on like decent, pretty good shooting for a guy as he's like working his way through the league and becoming a number 1, number 2 option. That's all really encouraging. And then you can do that while also 6'7" with long arms, being able to do a bunch of things defensively. And the Hornets had like a brief uptick after the trade deadline where they brought in like half a new team and shuffled the deck a little bit. And suddenly they were defending real well under Steve Clifford for a little bit. Like he has earned the confidence of a pretty crusty head coach and is somebody who has earned the minutes that he's gotten. It's not just like, well, this guy was a high pick, so you got to force feed him. He makes sense in today's NBA and in like whatever the vision of the future is for the Hornets. It feels like he's going to be a major part of it given the draft position and everything else. But sometimes you have players who restrict what that vision can be. And like you can't sketch things out in a certain way because that wouldn't fit that guy. I don't think that's Brandon Miller. I think Brandon Miller is the kind of guy where like you are, the Imagineering is like blue sky. Whatever you want to do, he's somebody that can fit into all of that.
Not knowing what the future is fine because they don't know what it is yet. That new ownership group just brought in Jeff Peterson. What's clear and what they've illustrated that this ownership faction to all the front office candidates that they were interviewing before they hired Jeff, as the word is still going on, is that like they want to make this a premier destination in the NBA, which is such a cliche, buzzy thing that everyone says when the new owner takes over and whatever. But I think they actually mean it. And I think that there's really intriguing starting pieces here, not just from the player standpoint, but they did a very good job at the deadline bringing back strong asset pool from the Terry Rozier trade to the Gordon Hayward trade. And they, by all accounts, plan to re-sign Miles Bridges this summer, which will be for way less than the 5-year, $180 million mark, by all accounts, that he was going to get before. And what kind of trade chip could that be? Or, just could he continue to grow alongside these guys? The other thing is, like, you mentioned the crusty head coach. Like, I'm not so certain Steve Clifford is going to be gone next year. That's kind of been like foregone conclusion, I think, in the coaching circles, that new ownership, new front office, like obviously the coach is next, but there's been, I think there's a lot of respect there for Clifford. there's a connection at least from him overlapping with Peterson in Brooklyn that one year he was a coaching consultant for the Nets. And he just is a very widely respected coach. Like I remember back before he ended things in Orlando that people kept saying to me on the phone, like the Magic just can't tank because Cliff just got these guys defending so hard.
Right.
And it was true. So I'll just be interested to see what ends up taking shape there, how the front office ends up finishing out. You know, there was all this talk that Matt Lloyd, the number, I don't know exactly what his number is in Minnesota, but a top ranking executive just behind Tim Connolly in Minnesota was going to be their main target for the number 2 under Peterson. It doesn't exactly sound like that is the current situation, being that I keep hearing that they are looking at 2 names. Still, there's probably others, but I have heard Sergey Oliva from Portland, who was in Philly for a while, was in Utah as an assistant under Quinn Snyder. Now he's an assistant general manager under Joe Cronin in Portland. And Brock Aller, the cap guy in New York, who has been credited for a lot of the stuff with the second round pick pool that they were able to acquire and whatnot. So those are 2 names that I have heard to just keep in mind on the radar for Hornets stuff. In Detroit, Dan, what are you intrigued about the Pistons, aside from the tough injury stuff that led us to you giving a lot of flowers to Asar Thompson at the top of the show?
Yeah, so the first one is Asar Thompson. Just a last note on him before we move on from it, because I looked these things up and I don't like to waste things I looked up. Estimated plus minus, a stat that I've cited on this show before. Taylor Snar at his website, Dunks and Threes, adjusts, how basically it's a way to try to measure how much you're impacting the game when you're on the court, considering your teammate, considering your opposition, etc. The defensive version of that, defensive estimated plus minus, has Asar Thompson as like a top 15 guy now, like today. The guys right around him on that list are Jalen Suggs, OG Anunoby, Mitchell Robinson, and Rudy Gobert. So in terms of, which is like a pass the smell test in terms of those guys being good in that number, it's like, all right, well, that lends some credence there. And he does that while guarding everybody from, SGA to Franz Wagner to Dame Lillard. So it's get well soon, Asar. I want to see you again. To me, I mean, the biggest thing, even in a pretty dismal context, which I think it's fair to say this season has been, Cade Cunningham in the second half of the season has started to look like the guy that they hoped he would be. We have had conversations on this show where it's like, is that just a wash, pick? Is that not going? Is the context going to make it such that he never gets to the level that they hoped he would? Is he just not the transformational kind of prospect that they thought they were drafting? And in the last couple of months, or since mid-December, so, half the season, 23 points, 8 assists, 4.5 rebounds, 38% on threes. So that's like the big swing piece for him. 39% on pull-up threes. That's been one of the big issues. Like, could he make enough shots? Could he on a high enough volume to open things up some more in that Detroit offense? Among rotation regulars, so guys that are, I think it was like the framing was 15 plus minutes a game, 15 plus appearances. The only guys with a higher assist rate in that span the last 3 months, Tyrese Halliburton, Luka Doncic, Trae Young, who are like the archetypes we're talking about with what Cade Cunningham was hoped to be, like the big orchestrator, see over the defense, make every pass, manipulate the chessboard, and create something on offense. And that's, again, in the context of a ton of losses on a team that has been absolutely dreadful. That's what he's been able to do. And so much, again, is going to come back to the context. And we talked earlier about the shooting issues. And, if Jaden Ivey can be the shot maker he was a couple months ago, as opposed to the one he is right now, that makes that backcourt more tenable. If Asar Thompson takes a leap there, that makes it more tenable. If they, I don't know, it remains to be seen what they do with Beef Stew, and like if his shooting uptick holds fast, I don't know. But more shot making around Cade, more space for him to play in, those numbers could play up even more. And that level of production that he's managed over the last, 3 months or so, that's the all-star stuff. And if you can get that with a more stable context around him, that could finally be the thing that helps the worm turn a little bit in Detroit. It's hard to find too many things to get super psyched about, but that's the thing. Like, nothing else matters if you don't have that guy. And the last few months, he's looked more like that guy than he had to this point in his career.
I'm not psyched about what I'm about to say, to use your parlance, but in the spirit of rooting for past top 5 picks to figure it out in some capacity, to just stick around the league and find happiness, James Wiseman, I think is going to get, this is just like educated guesswork more than reporting. I think he's going to get another like Marvin Bagley special, where, if you recall, the Pistons acquired Bagley from the Kings, and probably no one was going to give him the like 3-year, $30 million deal that Bagley got, 30 plus million. The Pistons, sent out their first round pick, Saddiq Bey, for James Wiseman. He's playing more minutes now post All-Star break, up to 17 a game. The defensive numbers are decent from an advanced standpoint. When he's on the floor, their defensive rating, 113, which we just talked about, top 10 number for Dallas. Not too far off. And just like, I remember when the Pistons were here last, or when I last saw them here at the Garden, him warming up with like coaches battering him with like football pads and working on defensive, like no one works on defensive rotations during pregame shoot around on the floor while the clock is ticking down from 90 to 0. But I saw it with James Wiseman. And if that work is paying off after he got, probably rightfully maligned for not turning into what the Warriors hoped he would become, I will be happy for him and for the Pistons if that turns into something Marvin Bagley-esque, where Bagley did actually become like a legitimate backup center type of player in this league, not for $30 million, but you know what I'm saying. We're going to move to the last 3 teams quickly here. With Washington, I'm going to say that at first, when they moved Wes Unseld to the front office,
management was restructuring.
Yeah, there were some questions around the league, like, oh, why is this happening now? Blah, blah, blah. What say you? It does seem like interim head coach Brian Keefe, who I believe was in Oklahoma City at parts when Michael Winger and Will Dawkins, the 2 leaders of that front office, along with Travis Schlenk, were with the Thunder. It does seem like, by all accounts, he's kind of the leader in the clubhouse right now to get that job moving forward. Seems like he could be the J.B. Bickerstaff in Cleveland, the Jacques Vaughn in Brooklyn before obviously that went wayward. For example, at this point, and maybe I'm speaking out of turn because I haven't really truly checked on this, but from everything I've heard throughout, like Kevin Ollie, I'm not expecting to be the head coach of Brooklyn next year, right? Mm-hmm. Brian Keefe, I think, is a super strong candidate for that to happen. And just little conversations I've had, like I keep hearing people talking about how they really like what the Wizards are doing schematically and what have you. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to run down the list of a team that's losing a lot of games and how great they're doing. But he's at least done enough that I think it's kind of become almost like a consensus in the coaching circles that we alluded to earlier, that he's potentially going to be the guy. And if he's not, it'd be like even like a surprise. So positive, at least like building block moving forward for Washington there.
That's interesting. And it calls to mind, you mentioned Oklahoma City. There was that idea of like Mark Dagnall, no one knew, or very few people knew who he was or what his situation was, but it was like, that's a guy that we believe will get us sort of formed in the right direction. And then we give him a long enough runway and we build something. Maybe they're hoping for a similar thing here, like get to play the sort of the right way and implement a style and then grow from there. I'm not going to lie, these aren't all going to be winners. But Deni Avdija, shouts out to you. He has gotten more opportunities to do things with the ball and has done more with them. There's caveats to it. A lot of this is happening, like I said, in games that kind of like don't really matter because the Wizards were like 3-17 and basically playing for nothing for months. A lot of it is colored by, he had one giant game against the Pelicans right before the All-Star break where he scored 43 points. There's also a question of like, could he be more in still like, a lot of his uptick has come in games where like Kyle Kuzma's not available or is off the floor, is injured or whatever. They're kind of similarly big combo forwards who would be making plays with the ball in their hands. So do they cannibalize one another to some degree? And then if Kyle Kuzma is somebody who is a building block, does that limit what Deni Avdija's contributions could be? But all that said, since Christmas, again, we're talking about like big samples, like 35 games, about half the season, 16 points, 8 boards, 3.5 assists, 56% on twos, well over 40% on threes while taking 3 of them a game. So like the volume is up there with the efficiency. He's had more 20-plus point performances since Christmas than he had in his whole career before that. And when the usage has gone up, the efficiency has gone up too. Like not at like full-on elite numbers, but it's hard to do both of those things when you are shouldering more of a load and also doing it more efficiently. Deni Avdija has been to this point the kind of player where you're like, oh, he's maybe a 3-and-D or like a defense and some playmaking, and you haven't seen those things, like the offensive components of that, really dovetail. He defends everybody. He works his tail off on that, and he's like a tough, rugged, physical defender. This is the first chunk of his career, really, where you're like, okay, I don't have to squint so hard to see the outline of somebody who can help a real team. Whether that's a real team in Washington or a real team, someone comes and gets him. He's on I think is like starting a 4-year, $55 million extension that's declining salary year over year. So he feels like the kind of guy that a smart team might want to take a run at because they look at it and say, we've now seen him scale up when he needed to. We also know we feel pretty confident he could do some of that in a smaller role while defending for us. Like there's a future there that maybe 6 months ago, I wasn't quite sure what it would look like. He has played himself into a conversation where you're like, I can sort of see that guy mattering in the league here. So that's, again, we're scraping a little bit on some of these. Shouts out to Tyus Jones. Shouts out to Bilal Koulibaly. Get well soon. All these sorts of things. And, we'll see where they go from here. But shouts out to Deni Avdija. I don't know that you're going to wind up on a whole lot of most improved ballots, but you have improved, and that is worth noting.
Portland, I'm just happy that DeAndre Ayton has found the right sleeping situation, being that he apparently was sleeping on an air mattress. He said, quote, I didn't have a bed for quite some time. I was on an air mattress, just trying to figure this out. My body wasn't my body. People forget the humane difference of me adjusting to everything. So he's just being comfortable and waking up. So shout out to DeAndre Ayton for being multi-millionaire whose 4-year, $133 million offer sheet from Indiana was like the story of the offseason for a long time, because every day I remember being in Vegas, I guess that was 22, for Summer League, like texting people on the situation. Is it coming today? Is the offer sheet coming today? Because like we all kind of knew it was coming, but it wasn't for option dates and what have you. So I'm glad he finally was able to get the sleeping arrangements that are necessary for him to be dominating out there.
Well, yes, sleep is key. Having a real bed is important. Even when you're, in your early 20s, maybe not something that you prioritize, but it's a good one to prioritize. And yeah, I think like that's my pick here is like the version of DeAndre Ayton they got the first half of the season was not going to help the Blazers figure out anything about their future. The version that they've gotten the last, since he came back from knee injuries, he was out for about 15 games from, in December and January with knee soreness. Since he got back to that though, he's actually looked like the player he was kind of late, at the apex of where he was in Phoenix. 21 points, 12.5 rebounds, 63% from the floor. The rebounding rates have been elite. Like he's the stuff that made you look at him during that the Phoenix finals run and say like, why aren't they just maxing this guy out? He's playing at that level. Opponents are shooting 56% against him at the rim, which is, strong mark among like high volume rim protectors. The Blazers have been about 6 points per 100 possessions better with him on the floor during this stretch. Like it's not superstar stuff in and of itself, but when you think about all the questions that the Blazers have to answer and figure out, like they didn't really see enough of Scoot Henderson and Anthony Simons and Shaedon Sharpe healthy at the same time to be able to kind of figure out what the pecking order is and who do you build around in what roles and how do they dovetail and all that kind of stuff. You still have to figure out, they didn't move Malcolm Brogdon or Jeremy Grant at the trade deadline. is that something that they're even interested in? Do they want to just say, well, let's get these guys together and sort of see what a functional version of this team with everybody healthy looks like? What is Robert Williams' status as he comes back from injury? Where do you find minutes for Chris Murray after you spent a first round pick on him and he kind of spent most of the season on the bench, all that kind of stuff? Like, there's still a lot to figure out here. But Ayton, if you have a legit rim protecting center who can provide 20 and 10 on high efficiency without needing to dominate the ball, that guy can help you figure out the answers. It's like you need the foundation before you can start building the other things on top of it. You would be within your rights to have some skepticism about DeAndre Ayton as that foundation. But if the guy they've gotten the last couple of months is the guy they're going to get moving into next season, I think it makes it easier to build on figuring out what comes next. So in a season where not a lot has gone right, that's at least something. You're getting what you had hoped for in terms of the return for him there. And then if you match that together with a couple other things going right, another high lottery pick, maybe you're in a better position to sort of round out the roster, figure out what you need and where you can get, how you can get it, and what you are willing to give up to go get it. But him providing that baseline hopefully helps them sort of figure out what comes next.
Speaking of providing baselines to help teams figure out what comes next, give me Trey Jones in San Antonio. 2-year, $20 million deal last year. And for all the talk of his brother, Tyus, being like the best backup, but like not good enough to be a starter, I think that conversation probably will end up happening with his brother, who also stands just 6'1" and 180 pounds. Once the games in San Antonio actually have greater consequence. But for now, after the great Jeremy Sohan point guard experiment that made a lot of us lose a lot of our hair because we either pulled it out or whatever, 35 games as a starter now for Trey Jones. And the dude is very dangerously flirting with a 50-40-90 production in that. 54.9 from the field, 41.4 from three, 89.7 from the free throw line. The guy just figures out how to get the ball to scorers, which is what the fucking role of a floor general is, man. Especially when you have a 7'4" behemoth who should be the easiest player to get the ball to in the history of the game. He's finally doing it. Someone's doing it. And obviously they're still at the bottom of the league, but there's been more and more nights where I tend to check in the league pass at around 9 p.m. Eastern when the games are in the fourth quarter some nights, because the boy needs some free time to just chill and not be thinking about the NBA all the time. And more the Spurs are in these dogfights till the end that are clearly learning lessons for moving forward. That Dallas game that we talked about at the top where Dante Exum ripped out their hearts, there definitely still was fun stuff from San Antonio down the stretch. And I just couldn't help, as much as I was watching that game with my eyes glued on Dante, because that's why I was definitely keyed in on that before I wrote the story that came out today. Again, yahoosports.com. I think it was so striking just to see how much more, because I hadn't really watched the Spurs in a couple of weeks. And I was thinking back to when I saw them here and when I saw them in San Antonio, when it was the LeBron Lakers versus Victor versus LeBron game in mid-December. They just have so much more of a flow and an actual process to things, man. It just is a revelation all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, there's a too cute by half component to this where it's the answer to the most interesting thing about the San Antonio Spurs is the fucking giant. But you're right. I mean, noting Trey Jones and noting the role he played, that was where one of the things that I feel got, I don't know if misconstrued is the right word. We all understood what it would probably look like when Trey Jones got on the floor with Victor Wembanyama at the beginning of the season. It was okay, really high floor, low turnover, table setting point guard. You kind of know what that's going to look like. The goal of those first 20 games was, let's figure out what else we could maybe do. And the experiment of Point Sohan, I wrote a lot about it. I really liked it as an idea. Let's try to expand skill sets. Let's see what other opportunities this might open up for us. If we play Victor at the 4 and we play a huge point guard and we play 2 7-footers together, what does that look like? And they found out and it sucked. It wasn't good. And when they like whatever, I think it was December 27th, I think is the date. That late, they put Zach Collins on the bench. They moved
they lost
Wembanyama to the
17
5.
straight games at one point. That's what ultimately helped switch that flip there.
Yeah. And they decide we're going to make Victor a full-time center. We're going to start playing Trey Jones more. And yeah, like it unlocks the team in a very different way. I know Zach Lowe had mentioned numbers like this and other people have as well, but it's worth citing. When you've got Victor Wembanyama, Trey Jones, and Devin Vassell, who's the third part of that kind of core triumvirate there, and you've got them on the floor together, the Spurs have outscored opponents by 174 points in 730 minutes. They've scored like a league average offense and defended like the best defense in the NBA. It's basically the Timberwolves math. And now they arrive at it differently. Victor is maybe like if you have Ant and Rudy Gobert smushed together in one guy. But the idea is like that's the exciting thing to me is you already have a functional core. And you're terrible, and you have 2 top 7 potentially picks coming in this draft, and then more coming, and then more cap space, and all these but you've already got like a proof of concept that makes sense. Victor is, if he's not, I love the line where he said like, Rudy is a very deserving defensive player of the year candidate now. Let him get it this year because then it won't be his turn anymore. Wembanyama is already one of the most impactful defenders in the NBA, and also somebody who's averaged well over 20 points and like several assists per game for the last few months. You can organize him. You don't need your point guard to be like a 25 point a game scorer if he's able to unlock those other guys. Devin Vassell, since they flipped that switch, as you mentioned, that late December thing, he's like 24.5 and 4.5 on 48, 38, 79 shooting. Like the functional pieces there make sense. And it gives you flexibility. You can say, there's been much made of the question of like, how patient is Victor going to be? And when do they have to start getting after it? Whatever.
It's a nonsense thing to state at game 63 of his rookie season or whatever they're at right now. Like
yes.
that whole thing. I know Vinny and Howard talked about this on very briefly. Like he's going to be in San Antonio for 7 years. And then we could maybe, but like, and this is where he wanted to go. He didn't want to go anywhere else. He was hoping and praying that he'd be with the Spurs, and they just built this new gleaming practice facility that's going to be all the shrine to developing the greatest prospect of all time. Like he's not going anywhere. It's not going to be. I'm just so like, as much as my job is to forecast what could happen and the player movement that could happen, like that is not one thing that is remotely on my radar right now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's premature to have that kind of concern. He's also the kind of talent that makes you start thinking about things fast. He accelerates things. But so the question is, in what way do the Spurs accelerate around him? There was rumblings about like, well, do they look for an upgrade at point guard? Is that a Trey Young team? Whatever. I don't know, man. Trey Jones looks like he's pretty friggin' good, and they seem to be developing really good chemistry, and there's something worth building on there. If you can go get a home run swing at point guard, awesome. If not, stick with this guy that you have on a real, cost-controlled situation that seems to be a really positive player for what you're building. Maybe and there's the question of internal development. They've got all these young guys there. I don't know, like, does Blake Wesley's jumper come along? Does Malachi Branham pop?
We said one interesting thing, Dan. Come on.
The interesting thing to me is this is all like teams that are this bad rarely have something this good to build on. They've got something in place that's real. So then how do you build around it? And do you decide like we got to go all in and trade picks for present day help, go and spend max money on somebody? I don't know. I think that finding out what they think of where they are will be interesting. But the fact that you've got already like a real something serious to build on right away is, I think it makes them a compelling team. Like there will just be no bad teams in the West by like the end of next year if these things pan out. Like all of your easy wins are gone essentially, like in year 2 of Wembanyama. So it's going to make that whole conference more of an insane bloodbath. But we'll get there when we get there.